RadioNext.tv on the Cool Groove site, and we are back. Yes, your man is back, Dr. Mark Eckel. I am back in the seat. We just want to thank Phil Moore for sitting in last week, and just want to let all of you know, thanks for your prayers. I felt them, and my baby girl is doing very well today.
That's excellent.
How you doing, partner?
Doing really well. Excellent. Can't wait for today's show.
We are here at Warp and Wolf Radio on the Cool Groove site at RadioNext.tv, and today we're going to be talking about flagrant unity in our community.
That's right.
I mean, reaching out on the real way. The show is brought to you by Comenius Institute. Mark, please, before we get into this, tell them about Comenius.
Yeah.
We're going to take our musical break and come back and get in it.
You bet. Comenius. John Amos Comenius, Moravian pastor from the 17th century, believed women should be educated. How about that?
What?
Oh, yeah.
Really?
How about that? He believed in wisdom that could be found anywhere. As a Christian, obviously, we know from Colossians 1:17, by him are all things held together. This Saturday evening, I'll be speaking at my church at a missions conference, presenting an overview of the Comenius Institute. Come on out. That's at Crossroads Community Church down on Southeastern Parkway, just past the hospital off 210, exit 210 off I-69.
Well, we're going to get this musical break on, and in the second hour, we have Pastor Eric Jewel Hayes Sr. coming up in here. Stay tuned. Warp and Wolf Radio on the Cool Groove site, RadioNext.tv. And we are back, RadioNext.tv on the Cool Groove site. Harold H.B. Bell, Dr. Mark Eckel in here on Warp and Wolf Radio. And as we mentioned earlier, we have a great show lined up for you. And working together and unity amid the differences is what the topic of the show is about today. And Mark, it is, before we get started, I know we do planning and have this thing laid out. But let's talk about real quick, if we can, recap that great documentary, because it's pretty relevant to this conversation and topic today. Addicts, a school that opened a city, was one of the most phenomenal documentaries I think I've ever witnessed in my life, and we want to thank Ted Green for allowing the RadioNext.tv platform and you and I to come down to be able to interview some of these great people.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, some of these legends of life. I mean, we were in the midst of greatness.
They were
95, 92, 97-year-old people with their faculties telling the true story. But your take on it?
My take on it was, as I was sitting watching the documentary after we had met all these wonderful folk and talked with them and interviewed them and so on, I was taken back in many ways to say, and feeling the pain of people, feeling the pain of what was done to people, and the sadness of this, and the awfulness of what has happened in the past. And like you and I always talk about, we should never forget history, but we don't need to live there either. And it's nice that it's a new day. We're just talking about that.
And that's, I guess, my take on it was the glory of watching people persevere through all of that.
That's right.
Getting stumped on and still rising like cream to the top. And I took glory out of it, because no matter how hard someone oppresses you, no matter how hard someone tries to keep you down, if you believe and have faith, things are possible.
That's it.
And that's what I witnessed, and that's kind of how the breath I live on right now. And that leads us right into this first segment. And we're talking working together.
Yeah.
And you and I do it, I think, very well.
I think so.
Eckel, thank you. I do love you back. I know you love me. But no, that's what we're doing. We are doing this thing in such a seamless way.
Yes.
And so tell us what the Bible tells us generally about the differences in unity in the church.
Right. So, honestly, I got to go right to John 17. When I think about this, I think about Jesus and his high priestly prayer. He was most concerned that believers would maintain a disciplined unity of belief. And he said over and over and over again, 3 times, he prayed to the Father that they may be one, that they may be one, that they may be one. So the whole point of this was that we're supposed to be unified. Now, we can find this all the way through Scripture. We find it in Acts chapter 2, the very first sermon that was ever preached from a Christian church. We find it in Romans 12, one body. There's a focus on others, one another, the members of the body. And ultimately, all of this really kind of comes down to you can't have community without unity. So the word unity is literally built into the word community, and the essence of that is huge for us. Well, then we get into, I think, one of the supreme passages concerning unity, which is Ephesians, the book of Ephesians, where you start out with the Trinity. You have 3 persons in one essence, the Father, Son, and the Spirit. And that then sets the precedence for chapter 4, where Paul says, you should have one Lord, one faith, one baptism, all of this denominational stuff, all this fragmentation stuff ought to all come together as a wholeness. Jesus' words that they may be one. There's the key.
And it's interesting that you mentioned that as we go to the second question that I have for you. And Proverbs chapter 30, verses 24 to 28.
Yep.
I have to go there. I'm an urchin. So, I'm all into Proverbs, and I kind of knew, but then when I went there and we were talking about the subject matter for today, it was phenomenal. Our ants and our spiders and our locusts and all these things that do for the well of, for the good of, without any thought.
That's right.
Talk about how those word pictures describe unity to our community.
Sure, absolutely. So I'll read these verses for us. 4 things on earth are small, but they are exceedingly wise. The ants are a people not strong, yet they provide their food in the summer. The rock badgers are a people not mighty, yet they make their homes in the cliffs. The locusts have no king, yet all of them march in rank. And the lizard you can take in your hands, yet it is in the king's palaces. Now, one of the things that Proverbs does all the time is it will say 3 things, yes, 4. And the whole point behind this is an emphasis. So it's kind of building. You're saying this, but then let me give you one more idea about this. So in this case, the idea is that seemingly weak things by themselves can be strong together, more than they could be by themselves, and that's really crucial. And the emphasis on wisdom is that you're supposed to work together. In fact, the words that are used here in the Hebrew, this word folk or people in 24 and 25, literally emphasizes the unity of the group. So I'll just run through these 4 groups quickly. The ants are industrious pre-planning groups. So in Proverbs 6, go to the ant, you sluggard. If you want to know anything about planning for the future, you got to go to the ants. The badger is a cautious, defensive animal. He's vulnerable to predators, but once he's in the rocks, man, you can't touch him. Locusts are organized cooperators. The Hebrew word there, go out, describes the advance of an army. If you want to find out about locusts, by the way, check out the book of Joel in the Bible. And then lizards are a courageous, bold bunch. You find them everywhere. It's hard to get into the king's palace, but not for the lizard. They're all there.
Slide up in there just
That's
like
right.
ice.
That's right.
Know. And it's amazing when we mention this of how simplified this is, but how difficult it is for man to swallow this and do this.
That's right.
And it gives me some thought about, are we too advanced in our wisdom and knowledge? Just a question.
That's right.
Last question in this segment. There are many differences within the church, Mark. Why is it important for God's people to be unified?
Yeah. Well, look, man, we can either stand together or fall alone. I mean, that's basically the bottom line. Community always benefits our people. So let me tell you about the story of the book of Acts. Acts chapter 4, verses 32 to 37. Here you have this wonderful community of people, and the text there says that everybody owned, whatever they owned, they shared with everybody else. Now, this isn't Christian communism. We're talking about private ownership, but when they saw the need of other people, they gave without any question, without any concern for their own liquidity or their own bank account. Bottom line, I'm stronger if I fight with you, not against you. I will find common ground so we can stand our ground together. This is huge. One more comment about the church. Man, I have read so many doctrinal statements from so many different churches, but bottom line is I have never read a document that has a doctrinal statement in it from a church that has one point on the unity of the church. Isn't this supposed to be the key?
Yeah.
Jesus says that they may be one. So I encourage all Christians, all churches out there to begin to think, how can I begin to think about this, not only in the doctrinal statement of our churches, but how do I enact this in my own personal life and the life of the church?
Absolutely. And then before we go to this break, last Thursday evening, if we could get a snapshot of that and just give to anybody, everybody, any race, creed, color, gender, you get a snapshot of what unity in our community should look like. We'll be right back. You're listening to Warp and Woof Radio on the Cool Group site, RadioNext.tv. Whoa, Mark Eckel, that sounds like you.
That's right.
RadioNext.tv on the Cool Group site, Warp and Woof Radio. And as you heard in the promo, Comenius Institute, that's who this show is sponsored by. One more time as we lead in, give some more info on Comenius, Mark.
Yeah, Comenius. We just met yesterday with some students, had some great chats with them. Basic bottom line is that we're providing a bridge between high school and college for young Christian folk who are going into public university so that they have a Christian emphasis in their studies. Somebody who is an academic listens to their questions.
And you know what I love about this is that it's the simple premise of what we're talking about today, community, coming together. Individually, this walk will be real tough,
real hard,
especially for new milk drinking Christians.
Yeah, that's right.
To say,
yeah.
It would be difficult, but what you're doing in convenience is actually having a net to say, okay, you're not the only one.
You aren't alone.
You're not alone.
That's
when you're
right.
not alone, there's strength in numbers. That leads us to the second segment here in the show. Why are some examples of unity and differences? Or what are some of the examples of unity and differences that we see around us in everyday life? We've already talked about you and I, but give us some more examples.
Sure. Well, I always have to go to the story that I love to tell about my daughter. When I took her to D.C. one time, we walked into the Lincoln Memorial. We went to the right into the portico that has the second inaugural inscribed in stone. And there were about 50 people in this portico. And here's Chelsea. She's about 12 plus years of age at the time. And she just begins to read this second inaugural out loud. And everybody went quiet. There was not a sound except for her voice reading the second inaugural. Now, if it's been a while since you've heard this or read this, let me read the last lines of Lincoln's second inaugural, because this really gets after what we're talking about. He wrote this and said this in 1864, quote, "With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have just borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all that which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations," end quote. And if we're going to talk about everyday stuff, here are the Lincolns of our day. We have Jim Striedelmeyer down on 10th Street. We've just had Jim up in here a couple weeks ago talking with him about his outreach to the prostitutes, to transgender people, to everybody who is poor in his neighborhood. He is the poor pastor living amidst the poor. I just met this last week with Nate Hershey from City Life Wheels. They just purchased a brand new place down in East Washington where he is helping disadvantaged youths, a lot of African American young men who are learning how to take care of cars. HB, you're going to love this guy, and you're going to love what they're doing down there. They just bought this building for about $250,000. He said, if I can't do this kind of thing in the Indianapolis 500 town, where else can I do this? So he's got money flowing into this nonprofit to help young men and young women work on cars. Here's an everyday example. And then, of course, we had Dantanya Batts up in here, not guilty. Wonderful young woman who is doing great things in the judicial systems. And these are just some examples of the modern day Lincolns who are doing this unity and binding up the wounds and looking for justice and lasting peace.
And what, if I could add to that, yesterday I had the pleasure of broadcasting live from the community construction fair.
Nice.
And if you don't know, you just don't know about some of these things. There were 35 vendors and more than 75 people there before I left in the first hour.
Nice.
Getting introduced to the field of construction, and I mean all the way from the top of the chimney to the bottom basement in the brick. And I mean, 60,000 jobs available, but we don't transfer that information and don't know. So just a big shout out to the Indiana Construction Foundation. Never knew about them, but we have a great relationship growing. But that's part of what community looks like.
That's huge.
What does community in our unity in our community look like amongst Christians? And tell us about some of the readings that you do. I know book and reading is your big deal. So tell us about some of the readings that relate to
this issue.
Unity in our,
Absolutely. Well, there's a conference coming up here, a national conference. It's going to be down in Nashville, Tennessee. It's called Onward, Engaging the Culture Without Losing the Gospel. That's August 25th and 26th, just this coming weekend, where they're going to bring all kinds of folks together. This is the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, a very important group, and they're doing good work bringing folks together. We had Mike Roll up in here, just this last month. We were talking about Q Commons with him. Don't forget the Q Commons event. You can actually attend this in Indianapolis. Go to qcommons.com, qcommons.com. Their event is the 13th of October on a Thursday night, and here's the title, Engaging Our Divided Nation. Man, if there's ever any example of division, we have it right here in our own nation, right? This is bad stuff, but we're going to come together as Christians and talk about this. Here are some examples of some great folks doing good things. We've got Horatio Luster, Indianapolis Peacekeepers, did the Locked Arms event last month. We've got the 10 Point Coalition, Pastors Charles Ellis, Charles Harrison, doing great work in the community. Growing Indy with Richard Samuels. We had Richard on the show. Wonderful, good stuff. I have to give a big shout out, though, again to the New York Times. I don't agree with some of what I read in the Times, but I certainly agree with David Brooks. He did a great piece here not too long ago, just a couple weeks ago in August, entitled Great Affluence Fallacy. That's Great Affluence Fallacy, where he said that money can buy privacy, but privacy often makes life worse. Money can buy privacy, but privacy often makes life worse. And he tells this story that Sebastian Junger tells in his book called Tribe. This is just a fascinating story. If you've not heard about Sebastian Junger's book Tribe, make sure you go grab a copy of this. But he tells a story about when whites were going west and they were usurping the lands of Native Americans, and the Native Americans would take hostages, white hostages. And what he tells this story, he said, whenever the white hostages were taken by the Indians, the Indians would try to give them back to the whites, but they wouldn't go. They kept running back to the Indian population. But the opposite didn't ever happen. You never saw anybody going from the whites into or from the Indians into the white community. You always saw the opposite. You saw whites going into the Indian community. And he says that the reason for this was because that the Native Americans had a better communal system. That is, that they had better understanding of each other and took care of each other better than the whites did as they were moving west. Isn't that a phenomenal story?
It's almost as phenomenal as last week when we were sitting inside the Walker Theater and you were embracing the fellowship of these older African American people. I mean, you could feel the pulse of the love, and I mean, if you didn't, something's wrong with you.
Oh, and here, just to say this story, what happened to me last week, I was listening to one of our interviewees this last week, and honestly, I was just sitting listening, and she was telling me all about what she was doing, and when she got all done, she gave me a kiss, man.
Yeah.
Gave me a kiss on the cheek. And I'm telling you that the reason why she did that was because I listened to her.
And she was so gracious, and she came back and introduced us to her husband and told us how great she thought we were. And I mean, okay, sister, you've been around here dealing with all this drama, and you finding it to give us love.
And we just listened. That's all we did.
But that leads us to the last question in this segment. And I know what it means for me, but do Christians bear responsibility to demonstrate what it means to be unified in our culture, and then explain that?
Yeah. So I'm going back to Jesus' high priestly prayer in John 17. I mentioned this already. 3 times Jesus says that they might be one. I've emphasized that the word unity is actually found in the word community. You can't have one without the other. What's fascinating to me, when I'm reading the Second Testament, most people call it the New Testament, we don't see denominational labels, for instance. We see the church in Ephesus. We see the churches of Galatia, the church in Philippi, the church at. Well, you get the idea. It's the church. It's capital T, capital C. It's the body of Christ. We're identified by Him, not by us. We're identified by Him, not by us. And HB, you and I talk about this all the time. How do we come together? This is very simple, folks. Very simple. You reach out, you invite, you participate, you communicate, you visit, you commune. It's intentional, man. It's intentional.
And the last thing that you said about that young lady that we had the pleasure of, you listen.
Yeah.
If you listen, you learn. I mean, we are so alike. I mean, the things that we are alike as people are so much more close to being together than the differences are apart.
Sure.
And if we could just, if you like blue and I like red, let's realize we just both like beautiful colors.
And one of the things that we have to add to this, and talk about being intentional. So here's just a very simple example of this. In the month of August, we have 5 Wednesdays. So I've got 5 shows in August. Out of the 5 shows, I have 4 African American brothers coming here.
Yes.
4.
Yeah.
Out of 5 in August. Now, I would tell you, and you know this already, that probably half or more than half of the people that we've had on my show are African American brothers and sisters. Why is that, Mark? Because I'm being intentional.
As I said before the show, you are being flagrant. About trying to embrace other cultures,
Yeah.
and we have to be. And no more than me. I say this all the time, and people, they laugh about it, but it's so serious. I'm like, if we as African Americans think that we're the only one affected by slavery, of course we were oppressed, and of course it's wrong. But if we don't consider what the Caucasian community dealt with after being used to something, over 200 and something years, whether it was right or wrong, the innocence of the culture they inherited isn't their fault. It's not the fault of a little girl who sees a black man wash her car and a little black maid bring her food. That's normal. She didn't do it out of spite. It's normal. She grew up into it. So all we can do is go back to the root of it and say, okay, here's where we were, here's where we need to go.
That's right.
We'll be right back. You're listening to the Comenius Institute on RadioNext.tv on the Cool Groove site. RadioNext.tv on the Cool Groove site. Dr. Mark Eckel, Harold H.B. Bell. We are live entering our third segment, last segment of the first hour before Pastor Eric Jewel Hayes Sr. comes up in the RadioNext.tv studio. And today our theme is unity in our community. Dr. Mark, Tracy Drains out there, and the 3M crew is listening. So let's give my little sister some love out there.
There you go.
But we are back. And what we wanted to do is just try to figure out, Dr. Mark Eckel, with your quest to be flagrant about your quest
That's
to
right.
find out what's happening in different communities and different cultures. Something happened to you this past spring that prompted the show today. Would you be willing to tell us about it?
Yeah. So I'm taking some courses at IUPUI toward a master's in literature, learning a whole different language, literally. So I'm sitting in a class and dealing with theory and investigating how to think about life from a literary point of view. And one of the things in our text was comparing W.E.B. Du Bois, or Du Bois, depending on how you want to pronounce that, and Booker T. Washington. And so I had the opportunity to actually do a presentation in front of class about this. So I did this PowerPoint presentation, and I gave some background about both men. Here you've got W.E.B. Du Bois, who grew up as a free man and yet took a left turn in terms of becoming quite liberal in his point of view. You have Booker T. Washington, who grew up as a slave but became very conservative in his point of view, and then seeing how those two men and how their differences were very pronounced during their day, right around the turn of the 20th century. Well, I went through this whole presentation, did this whole thing, showed how there were differences even coming down through history, like between Malcolm X and MLK, for instance, or between Jason Riley, who is a conservative writer for the Wall Street Journal, and Cornel West. So I'm showing all of these things, and then I began to give an example of Cornel West and Robert P. George. Now, for those of you who don't know who Robert P. George is, he is a Princeton professor, teaches law. He's argued cases before the Supreme Court. But what you might not know about him is that Cornel West and he are best friends. So here you've got Robert P. George, who's conservative and a white man. You've got Cornel West, who's a liberal and a black man, who are best friends. If you go on the internet and you look up images of these guys, you'll see Cornel West with his arms wrapped around George. George has this smile on his face. Cornel West is laughing out loud. It's so much fun. So anyway, they get all upset last semester about, and I'm talking about West and George now, because they're saying basically that the colleges are not allowing dialogue between different groups of people who believe different things. They're just legislating, saying if you don't believe this, then you can't speak to that. So they're basically going around the country and going to these colleges and saying, you need to listen. Here's a conservative white man and a liberal black man, and we're both united in this perspective. So then the very last thing, HB, I show this picture. This picture of Robert P. George and Cornel West holding hands, heads bowed, praying. Two Christian men, totally different in their perspectives, but two Christian men who are united in this quest to bring unity to the academic community. Isn't that cool?
kind of like a bootleg. You and I are
That's right. Yeah, we're doing that here.
We're doing that. No, but I mean, I think that's beautiful because really we have to get to the point to where we just accept each other's differences, to love each other for the, like you say, the common denominator is how do we love each other as free and as pure as possible without judgment so we can move forward together.
That's right.
Isn't that the cause?
It's not the
I
truth.
tell people all the time when you watch the basketball games, this Olympic gold medal team, they had some big guys down low that couldn't dribble a lick. I mean, really.
Yeah.
So they're useless if you don't have a guy who can dribble on the team.
Mm-hmm.
And then you had the big guys where everybody's swarming them down low, and if he couldn't pass it out and guys hit shots, they would be useless. So, you know, if we look at it from that perspective, then we can make gain on this. Man.
That's right.
I appreciate your diligence to say, let me get out here and cross these cultures to find out who these people are, that everybody's ostracizing and people are trying to oppress. I applaud you for that. In your experience, how have you seen the Christians come together for common causes, particularly here in Indianapolis?
Yeah, so I've seen this over and over again. We've talked about various pastors. We've talked about the 10-Point Coalition. We've talked about Growing Indy, all of those different folks. We talked about the Addicts movie this last week. I want to give out a big shout out to the homeschooling community because these are folks who really have a common cause, come together for the same thing. But I got to tell you one other story about this, and this is actually outside of our country. We were just mentioning this off air, actually. When the old Soviet Union, just before the old Soviet Union fell, back in 1989-90, and you still had the Eastern Bloc communist countries, there was a situation where Ceausescu, who was the president then of the old Czechoslovakia, was trying to eradicate the Christian voice in Czechoslovakia. And so what he did was he was sending tanks to destroy churches. Well, in one particular episode, and this was just before the fall of the Berlin Wall, one particular episode, he sent these tanks, a squadron of tanks in to destroy a church. And this little group of Christians who belonged to this local church formed a circle around their pastor and around their church. And the tank commander refused to fire on this group of people. And that was the beginning of the end, HB. There it is right there.
Absolutely phenomenal. As we get prepared for the second hour with Pastor Eric Hayes Sr., you know, we get in a lot of deep conversations. And when we were watching the movie last Thursday, the fabric of the church was just so, it was so strong throughout this documentary.
Yep.
And I say to people out there listening right now, if the strongest we ever have been is because we were united through the church.
Yes.
The weakest we've ever been is the lack of the church in our community.
That's right.
Can we just simply say, let's get back to understanding the church and the power of the church in our community?
Yeah, this is huge. It's a big issue for us, and I'm going to tell you this, HB. I think one of the biggest stumbling blocks to unity in the church is one word, and that's pride. And we cannot get over ourselves. We think that somehow we can do this alone, or that somehow we don't have to be humble or gentle or patient with anybody else. It's my way or the highway. Ultimately, at the end of the day, that is the biggest problem that we face in the church, and frankly, as human beings, is that we think we're all that.
And that pretty much takes us back to what we started with the Proverbs and, you know, people sacrificing
That's
for
right.
the whole.
That's right.
You know, what are you going to do for the good of the whole?
Right.
And once we get there, we're okay. We're going to take a short break. When we come back, Eric Hayes Sr., Pastor Eric Hayes Sr. is going to be in the house, and we're going to find out more about how we can bridge these gaps in our community. You are listening to RadioNext.TV on the Cool Groove site.
God is not absent on my campus. This is how one Comenius Institute student sees our work at IUPUI. Hi, I'm Dr. Mark Eckel. Multiple studies show that 75% of Christian young people may leave the church altogether after attending public universities. One of the key ingredients to maintaining Christian faith commitment through college is personal, spiritual investment in students. We are committed to spending time with Christian young people. The Comenius Institute, where Christian wisdom and college life meet. And we are back at RadioNext.TV on the Cool Groove site. This is Warp and Woof Radio. And this week we are dealing with a very important issue, the issue of conciliation. How do you bring unity amidst difference, working together? I told that story this last hour about W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington, how I got started on this. And I asked my friend Eric Hayes to come in, Pastor Eric Hayes, to come in and talk with us about this relationship between Du Bois and Washington. Pastor, we're just thrilled that you're here today. Thank you ever so much for spending time with us. Tell us a little bit about yourself, your family, your church, life experiences, and what kind of work you do in the Indianapolis area.
Well, I'm glad to be here with you today, Dr. Eckel. I actually am the founding pastor of the Restoration Baptist Church at the corner of 15th and New Jersey. 15th and New Jersey. Every time I tell people that, they start looking up in the sky to try and envision it, and they say, well, I can't see it, but it's really there.
It is.
As a matter of fact, I always tell people we have the dubious distinction of holding church service in the first church building of Jim Jones.
Oh.
So everybody then begins to make a connection. For me, I come from a family of 9 children. My father died when I was 4. As a matter of fact, that was a pretty sorry Christmas. His funeral was December 23rd, 1964. And my mother, a woman of God who did an absolutely amazing job of handling 9 children, 5 hard-head boys and 4 mouthy girls. And she really did a great job in dealing with us. And so out of that, we ended up being attendees at First Baptist North Indianapolis. And from that, my mother was able to see the Lord realize in us that we're all believers. And there's a lawyer in the group, and there are a couple of preachers in the group. I believe 7 or 8 of us actually have college degrees.
Wow.
And it's all, it really is a tribute to what she instilled in us. To strive for excellence despite your circumstance. And so in 2001, Restoration Baptist Church had its beginnings, and we are now in our 15th year. And even now we are actually looking to try to do some type of church revitalization. We want to try and revamp what we're doing at Restoration and begin to do things a different way. We have things going on around us in our neighborhood where we are at 15th in New Jersey, and we have to try to respond to that in a way so that we can try to remain effective in ministry. I don't believe that Restoration is even close to being what God would have us be, but of course, if we just keep pushing on, I believe that He has a lot more for us, even in these next 15 years.
That's great. That sounds like a great ministry. Tell us a little bit about your immediate family, about your wife and your children.
I'm married to Lisa, and if she's listening, I'll say hello. And Lisa and I have been married for 31 years.
Congratulations.
We have 3 kids, Eric Jr., Meredith, and Camille. And Camille is the only one at home with us right now. She graduated a couple of years ago from University of Missouri. Very proud of my kids. She graduated as an honor student from journalism. And my oldest daughter, Meredith, she lives and works in Louisville, Kentucky. Stayed there and got a job after receiving her MBA from the University of Louisville. They were both track athletes in college. And my son, Eric, who is kind of the quiet protector coming up, is the one who's able to he's so very creative. He cooks, and he's able to he does choreography.
Wow.
And he and Camille have actually coached gymnastics. All 3 of my kids came up doing gymnastics, and it really helped them even with their studies. In that they had to learn to structure themselves so that they could, if they wanted to be able to do gymnastics, they had to be able to handle schoolwork and gymnastics. And any parents out there that have kids on gymnastics teams, they know how demanding it is to be on a gymnastics team. When Camille was 9 or 10 years old, she was probably in the gym 20 hours a week.
Wow.
And so Eric was kind of their trailblazer. He led them into all of this, being the first one to do all of that. And so he's actually was able. He's so independent, a whole lot like his mother. And so we actually have been very blessed with what our kids have done. They have really never given us any great problems, and I'm thankful to God that He's blessed us with 3 wonderful kids.
They sound wonderful, and absolutely great family structure. But it leads me to ask this question, and that is about family. How important are parents in the life of children?
Indispensable. You simply cannot replace them. While you can have stand-ins, they cannot be duplicated. And neither the mother nor the father. So they each have their place in what they do and how important they are to the development of the child. And we have to think about the fact that that when that child is growing up with one parent, as much as we don't think so, there is something that is missing from that child.
Yeah,
there is something that's missing.
It strikes me as we're talking about this and talking about your family, makes me think about the addicts comments that you made prior to coming on air. And why don't you just tell us a little bit about that? Because I was really taken by what you suggested about walking down that hallway in those pictures. Tell everybody about that.
I am a proud graduate of Crispus Attucks High School, class of '78, and it really did. I said the power of the photographs on the wall of your parents, your siblings who went through that school before you. They have a sobering effect in that when you see yourself getting a little out of hand, those pictures remind you to mind yourself, to mind your manners, to care about how you act. A short story here I've told before. I was a freshman, and I was in ROTC for 4 years at Crispus Attucks. We probably had the greatest drill team that has ever existed on the planet. I'll just say that. And anybody that ever saw us, they know that that's true. We were roughhousing in a back hallway. Several of the guys from ROTC, we had a couple of guys come up in the hallway, and they started criticizing us because we had to wear our military uniforms on Thursdays. And, of course, they were called monkey suits and things like that. So we kind of roughed a couple of guys up. So as we made our way to the front hallway, this was at the end of the school day, and everybody's headed toward the front of the building. They're going to get on their bus. Our principal, Earl Donaldson, he hollers my name. He says, "Hey, Hayes, come here." And I'm putting my finger up to my chest, pointing to me, and he says, "Yeah, I'm talking to you." So, of course, all my cohorts, they no longer wanted to be around me.
Of course.
And they said, "Hey, Hayes, we got to go catch a bus." Like roaches when the lights come on, they scattered, and I'm standing in the middle of the front hallway by myself. And I said, "Were you calling me?" He said, "Yeah." He said, "Your name is Hayes, isn't it?" I said, "Yes, sir." He says, "Hey, how's your Aunt Geraldine doing?"
Just like that.
Just like that. And I said, "Excuse me?" He said, "Your Aunt Geraldine, you do have an Aunt Geraldine, don't you?" And then I started thinking. I said, "Oh yeah, my Aunt Jerry." I said, "Yeah." I said, "Yeah, I've got an Aunt Jerry." He says, "Yeah." He says, "We went to school here together." He says, "We went to school here together, and she was one of my good friends." He says, "You tell her I say hello when you talk to her." And then he began to relay a story to me that I did not even know about my aunt. That my aunt was actually in line to. She was in line to receive the 4-year award of perfect attendance. And she ended up getting measles with something like the last week of school.
Oh, no.
Yeah, and nobody had ever told me that story before. And so I think she ended up missing 2 days of school in her senior year. And she would have had perfect attendance for 4 years. Of course, she told me about it after I reminded her. But so those are the types of things. And here's somebody who can tell me something about my family that I didn't even know, and somebody who knew me on sight, but primarily because he was also principal to those who were in the school before me. So he knew me by the way I looked.
So much of education today is doing the online thing. How do you respond to that when just because of your own personal experience, how do you respond to the necessity of being face-to-face in education and the importance of that in a culture today?
I am in the process of that right now, working on a master's degree, but we do what's called blended courses, where 2 days out of the module, you actually stay in school all day. As an old school guy, I kind of need that. I need to be able to talk to this person who's teaching the class to understand exactly what they're expecting of me, and also to get a sense of who they are.
Yeah.
And so those types of things are, I think, very helpful. I think online school is to just go totally online. I guess it's okay for some, but if I can make a reference to Scripture, discipling involved the person as much as it involved the lesson.
That's right. There you go.
And so if you don't have that person-to-person relationship, it's kind of like a do as I say and not as I do. It has that type of effect. And so nobody has modeled it before you. What I'm teaching you to do about mathematics, whether it's engineering or architecture, or even if it's trying to get a master's in divinity, nobody is modeling that before you. You're kind of on your own.
When you were telling that story specifically about your principal calling you out and about your aunt, I was thinking that the first thought in my mind was he saw you and he was basically just telling you a story to kind of move you back in a different direction. But what you're suggesting here is that this was just kind of a normal, everyday thing.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, I really respected Earl Donaldson quite a bit because I ended up having in my senior year, I had an economics teacher who flunked me in a 6 weeks course, and honestly, later on he told me he flunked me because he didn't think I was trying hard enough and he thought I could do better, and so he literally gave me an F. And so this was a problem because I was on the wrestling team, and this guy who was the economics coach economics teacher was actually the wrestling coach.
Oh,
and he flunked me.
Oh,
and so I had reasons why I thought he flunked me as well. I got an F, so then my mother had to go to school. Of course, that is the worst thing in the world. The worst thing in the world if your mother has to come to school. But when I was sitting there, we were sitting there, Mr. Donaldson and I were sitting in the office waiting for the teacher to come down, waiting for my mother to come to school, and he relayed this story to me. He told me about how he had gotten his master's from IU, and he said on one of his papers where he thought he had done so well, he got a C. He said, and he thought the paper was very good. And he said, so he went to the professor and said, I wanted to talk to you about my grade. He said, oh, yeah. He said, it was a very good paper you did. He said, you thought the paper was good? He said, yeah, I thought the paper was very good. He said, well, you gave me a C. And he said, well, that's all you could get. He said, well, no, you just told me that the paper was very good. Why did you only give me a C? And he said, the professor then got quiet for a second, looked him in his eyes and said, a C is all you can get. And so he said, what could I say? He said, I packed up my stuff and I walked out of his office. I understood what he meant. Moments like that to be able to help you along the way.
Makes a difference. We're going to come right back after a song. We are here at RadioNext.tv at the Cool Groove site. You're listening to Warp and Woof Radio. We're going to come back and talk about W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington. We are on RadioNext.tv at the Cool Groove site. This is Warp and Woof Radio. We are in the house today with Pastor Eric Hayes. Pastor Hayes is here to chat with us about W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington. And let's just start right off with that first question about them. How would you describe the two of these men, Pastor, from your perspective? What is your view of them?
I believe both of these guys were too driven by their ideologies to ever have any real compromise.
Okay.
Also, their histories were entirely there was entirely too great a contrast in their histories for any type of synergy to be developed. In Ralph McGill's last interview of Du Bois, I think that Du Bois did the best job of describing the angst that existed there. And he talked about their contrasting lives. This man was born into slavery. He said, my great-grandfather fought in the Revolutionary War. I was born free. And so he always aspired to do greater things than really Booker T could have even imagined. So Booker T is look, I'm just down here trying to keep black folk from being lynched.
Okay.
And here Du Bois is up north going, no, we need to be respected and given dignity as people.
It's interesting that you mentioned this last interview. Just for the sake of everybody listening, Du Bois outlived Washington by about 50 years? It was a long time.
1915 was it?
1915, and Du Bois died in 63, I believe.
Which is another thing is that he died on the eve of the March on Washington.
Yes.
Isn't that
something? I mean, when you stop to think about some of this, it's really fascinating to see the intersection of this. How much do you think that played a role in terms of Du Bois living so much longer than Washington, in terms of how people view them anyway?
Well, here's kind of how I feel about that. One, as you read about Booker T and his ideology, really, by my thinking, it's really quite offensive. But I think that because he did so much and we didn't have as long a time to look over his life, I believe he is celebrated more as a hero because his life was so short. And but we have this long look at Du Bois, his ups and downs, his rants.
Yes.
and so I think that most of us feel like we have just this greater idea, and so I believe that because of that we don't celebrate him as much.
Okay. All right.
Because we didn't get as big a dose of him as of Booker T.
Boy, there's so much to say about all this. You know, we really need hours and hours and hours to unpack all of these ideas. But let's go to the issue of our talk today, which has to do with unity overcoming difference. Were the two men working toward and for the same cause, do you think? Generally speaking, how would you say that?
Difficult question. difficult question because I think that you're asking us now in the 21st century to know their intentions.
Yes.
And as I said earlier, I think Booker T was just trying to keep black folk from being lynched and burned. And here you had Du Bois, who was saying, no, we need to be given full civil rights as citizens of the United States. And so I do believe, personally, that Booker T. Washington had been conditioned by his upbringing.
Okay.
When he took Du Bois to the house of Carnegie, and he asked him on the way over, "Have you read his book?" And he said, "No, I haven't." He says, "Well, you should read it." He said, "Mr. Carnegie would like that." He said, "Mr. Carnegie likes it." And all that did was throw me back to that time when we think about how slaves were so servile that they felt how the master felt. Master, you sick? Well, I'm sick too, master. Master, you happy? Well, I'm happy too, master. That's what I immediately thought of. And I don't think, I think that in his heart of hearts, I believe Booker T. Washington felt like he was doing a good thing. I don't think what he was doing was a good thing.
So looking back in history, it's hard for us to look back on history and have a good idea of intentionality.
Of intentionality,
Yeah.
It really is.
Yeah.
It really is. I think I always try to these reflections such as this. I always try to tie it to what's going on, and I see Du Bois as, or I should say, I see Barack Obama as type of a Du Bois.
Okay.
When I'm reading that, the world thought it was ready for Du Bois, but they weren't. And when I say the world, I should say white America thought they were ready for Du Bois, but they were not. And the world thought they were ready for a black president, but they were not. I think of the fact that all of our presidents who were so well educated, who went to Ivy League schools, and it was really disheartening when all of a sudden this guy who went to Columbia and Harvard Law, that now when he was running for president in 2008, then now all of a sudden his education is used against him. That these same people who always said that the president of the United States has to be from the best and the brightest, now all of a sudden, because Barack Obama is so bright, he's an elitist. So I think they thought they were ready for a black president, but they weren't.
The prejudice that comes along isn't just about ethnicity. Prejudice can be simply born out of envy or pride.
Oh my goodness!
Yeah,
Yes.
I mean, that's really where this all comes from ultimately.
Yes.
Well, it brings us to this next question then. In your view, what were the most pronounced differences between Du Bois and Washington?
It was their upbringing, I believe, is the greatest difference that existed between them, because it drove them to approach the Negro problem, quote unquote, from entirely two different perspectives. And what I appreciated is their attempts to get along.
Okay.
I really appreciated their attempts to get along. I think they had to respect each other.
Okay.
Because they knew that there could not be an open feud between them, because this would be a problem for the advancement of Negro people. But I don't think they saw eye to eye very much at all.
All right.
They didn't see eye to eye very much at all. And I think that they, out of respect for the other, I think they tried to get along.
So we can at least celebrate the respect,
Yes.
and we can celebrate their attempts
Yes, and I think that that's one of the things. That's one of the examples that they show us is how well people can do to get along, even in the face of differences. Because I think they did a very good job of that until they could not any longer. Because now, here's one of the things I do want to say, that as arrogant as Du Bois was, and everybody says he was, I believe that same arrogance was in Booker T. But I believe he only had the nerve to demonstrate that arrogance when he was talking to other black people.
Ah, okay. Audience matters.
Yes.
Okay.
In his backroom dealings of trying to subvert some of the activities of Du Bois, simply because he didn't want him to succeed. I believe that in that is arrogance.
So the real issue that we face constantly, I mean, this was one of the questions that we had prior to your coming on air, was the issue of what is the one thing that's keeping us apart? And my response is always going to be pride. Our pride gets in the way of
our pride gets in the way of respect.
Yes.
And so I'm so prideful about who I am, I can't respect what you're trying to do.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I do. I mean, that original sin.
That's right. There it is. How about that? It comes back to Genesis 3 again.
Yeah, it comes back to Genesis 3. That pride. You know, the reason Satan couldn't stay in heaven, pride.
Yep.
That he had in himself. And so these guys, I believe, for the betterment of the people, tried to keep it together as long as they could.
Okay. All right. Well, tell us a story or two about the men that shows their desires, at least, the attempts, as you well suggested early on, to do the right thing, to do good things.
I think that Booker T, when many were ready to excoriate him after his speech at the Atlanta Compromise, which put him in favor with many blacks and a whole bunch of white folks.
Yes.
I think that Du Bois coming to his defense was a way of trying to keep the peace and trying to also demonstrate that there was worth in what Booker T was doing, who he was, but let's pick through it and see what he's trying to say, because at the end of the day, black people were being educated at Tuskegee, and so I think that Du Bois really went outside of himself when he came to his defense after that speech, the Atlanta Compromise.
And he did, later on, he did walk that back a little bit in terms of how he didn't want to certainly be so closely tied to that speech and to that perspective. Right?
Well, after the meeting where Grover Cleveland attended in New York, where he just absolutely lambasted Negroes for their lack of morality, their laziness, and how they were, and now they weren't lazy when they were picking cotton and tobacco on plantations, but now that they were free, they were lazy, and also they're they're prone to criminality.
Oh, no.
They lack character. And another thing I'd like to point out, let me deviate for a second, is through the readings, one of the things, Dr. Eckel, that poked out at me constantly was the preeminence of Darwinism in what Grover Cleveland was saying, and what Carnegie was saying, and what Booker T. Washington was saying, and even in what Du Bois was saying, how readily we use the word race, how they use the word race, which, personally, I try never to use the word race. I always try to use the word ethnicity, in light of the fact that it gives credence to Darwinism.
Yes, it does.
That there are races and
Yes.
there are not.
Right.
And so, if I use the word race, then I'm giving some credit where it should not be given. And I think it was just so hurtful. Quite honestly, and I guess it's just the preacher in me coming out, that the type of comments that were coming from people who were supposed to be these leaders and people of great intellect, the hate that was involved was nothing short of demonic for me. It really was. To have that, to lynch a black man, and then put his knuckles and fingers on display in your store.
That's just beyond comprehension for anybody today.
To constantly speak of the immorality, the savagery, the criminality of the quote-unquote Negro, while you were lynching them and burning them and dismembering them.
What do you even say to that? It's just so awful and ugly.
It's nothing short of demonic. It is nothing short of demonic for me. Where do you have to be? Where do you have to be to turn to a man and tell him that he's not worth anything, and then you turn around and lynch him and cut his body in pieces?
Yeah. The ugliness and awfulness of this. This is just the saddest thing to me, I think, as I look back on history, is the awfulness and the abysmal treatment of people, that people would treat each other this way, and especially white people who would treat black people this way. The ugliness of this. And I'm really glad that you mentioned the connection to Darwinism, because when we stop to think about this, this is an anti-Christian point of view. And so, as Christian preachers, you and I are going to accede to this.
I can't help but say something about it. Please. In light of the fact that Grover Cleveland's comments had to do with the fact he says that you all are centuries away. Black people, you are centuries away from getting to where the Anglo-Saxon is what he was saying. And so, it was drenched. It reeked in Darwinism. His statements reeked with Darwinism. That we had to evolve some more before we got to the place where we were as civilized. Now, this whole thing about this civilizing mission, is the title of it is offensive in and of itself. That we were not already civilized.
Yes.
Never mind you that there were African cities that were being built.
That's right.
When Europeans were living in caves. But we have to be civilized. We need to go on this civilizing mission so that we can get these Africans to be civilized. You have to laugh to keep from crying.
This is the awfulness of it when you stop to think about the anti-Christian perspective that then gives us words like survival. Where we have to survive something, when indeed this is simply an evolutionary point of view. As you've well suggested about civilizing people, this is just beyond the pale.
And how I believe, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that this social construct called racism, it had to be played out. It had to be swallowed fully by the framers, by the nation's fathers, because these people who claimed that they loved God and that they were Christian people had to come up with a way to capitalize on the dehumanization of an entire ethnic group,
and here
so that they can still call themselves Christian.
Yeah, and here we come back to the issue of Genesis 3 again. We are always pointing fingers at somebody else. We're always rationalizing our own actions, whatever the case might be, which really kind of brings me to this next question. Do you think that the views of Du Bois and Washington would be accepted in our present culture?
Whether or not it's accepted, I believe that they're always there.
Okay.
I believe we have these views. I mean, right now, if I mean, right now we have these people who are black, who really, in my estimation, they hold to some of the beliefs and teachings of Booker T today. I mean, especially when we listen to a lot of blacks who are, how do I want to say, are prominent Republicans, or at least they're put out there as prominent Republicans. When I think of people like Armstrong Williams, who when I think of people like Lee Elder, who say things that are I don't even listen to them anymore because they're like it's like fingernails on the chalkboard to me when I listen to them speak about what it is black people have to do in order to get better. One of the things going on is Booker T. Washington is talking about civilizing the Negro. And one of the things I wrote down here, which I'm going to always remember, where he says here, no race that has anything to contribute to the markets of the world is long in any degree ostracized. And so he honestly believed that if we could show that we were a benefit to the community, to the world, that we would then be accepted. So, first of all, you're saying, Booker T, I have to prove myself worthy of receiving dignity.
So your basis for being worthy or having any kind of dignity is based on production over personhood,
which is a communist.
It's Darwinistic in its base.
Yeah, I have to show that I'm of some use to society. Right. Which is communist. Yeah. It's socialistic, and so now I think about that, and I said, well, is that true? Well, I think at last estimation, African Americans attribute 1.2 trillion to the economy of the United States, and still inequality is prevalent.
The difficulties that are just continue.
Yes.
No matter what.
And he really believed this, and that's what he was pushing for, to show that we were worth being looked at as regular citizens.
So, as two Christian brothers sitting here today, two Christian preachers sitting here today, how do Christians promote conciliation, working together, despite differences that we have in whatever framework that might be?
I think we have to own our differences and own our flaws. We have to ask it. We have to ask and seek forgiveness. We also have to seek reconciliation. And so that requires that we are honest with ourselves about who we are and what we've done. And how do I say this now? I'll say something here controversial. Maybe it's a bit controversial on the show, but I never believed in reparations until recently, and I think that I believe in reparations now because I'm a bit jaded by what I've seen in my 56 years, and materialism is the only thing that this world respects.
It's an unfortunate thing, isn't it?
Yeah. And so here's my issue. In Ken Sande's book, The Peacemaker, he talks about he gives these ingredients and these processes that we can use in order to achieve resolution. But he says this in his book. He says sometimes, he says, as a believer, he says, we should have the resolve to be able to say, okay, this was done to me. Somebody did this to me. I was offended by this. They were guilty. But sometimes we have to be big enough to say, I'm going to move on despite that.
Despite the issues, yeah. So ultimately...
But the other thing he says sometimes, he says the offense is of the magnitude where you cannot look away from it. And he said, and so sometimes, he says, there has to be some type of reparation. Sometimes there has to be sometimes the grievant has to be made whole because the offense was so egregious.
The issues that face us are huge. This is not anything that any of us are going to walk away from today without some kind of connection, not only to our past, but what we need to do into the future.
Yes.
And how we need to treat each other in the future.
Yes, I agree. Yeah. And that's how we resolve this. That in Ephesians 2:14, this sets a wonderful verse that Paul talks about this conflict that exists between Jew and Gentile. I believe that application can be applied to black and white today. And I believe because there's a problem of light and dark all over the world, not just in America. And so he says in Ephesians 2, he says, look, these battles that you're trying to fight, he says, Christ has already overcome them. He says, so you have no business going against one another. You have no business having this enmity between you. He said, because now I've made you all brothers.
And that's, I don't know if any better place to stop than that. Unfortunately, we have to. It always pains me every week to actually stop the interview because we could go on and on and on. Pastor, we are so grateful for your time here with us today. Thanks so much for spending time.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll look forward to the future. But next week, we're going to have Hosea Baxter from Crossroads Bible College on.
Amen.
And we'll look forward to hearing his voice next week. You were listening to RadioNext.tv at the Cool Groove site. Next week, 10 to 12 noon, you will hear Warp and Woof Radio again. Until then, we'll see you.